Quick fixes for hooks, improving undergraduate research papers. The hook is supposed to hook the reader. It appears at the beginning of the paper and it attracts the reader's attention. A hook can be a single sentence, an entire paragraph, or several paragraphs. The length of the hook depends on the length of the text. So, don't spend 3 paragraphs intriguing your reader with a story only to conclude 2 paragraphs into your argument. General rule: if you use a longer hook in an academic argument, then write a longer text. Types of hooks. There's the rhetorical question, the surprising fact or statistic, the narrative, the quotation, and the point of agreement. Let's begin with the rhetorical question. For a rhetorical question, you ask a rhetorical question not because you want to know the answer, but because you want to make a point. What is the purpose of a rhetorical question? The question itself encourages the listener to consider a viewpoint. Do you answer a rhetorical question? Usually no answer is expected. The question itself is a tool. A rhetorical question is a figure of speech. Example: you walk into the kitchen and someone says, "Were you born in a barn?" Obviously, the purpose of this question is to make a point. You have been messy somehow. Maybe you tracked mud into the kitchen. It is more effective than saying, "This is messy." An example of a rhetorical question in a paper is, "Would you volunteer to die?" Obviously, the purpose of this question is to make a point, since most people would answer no. Now, here's a better, more specific question that ties to a particular argument. Would you volunteer to die in the place of someone that you love? So a paper about the Hunger Games might begin with this. And obviously, most people would answer yes. Application. Rhetorical questions tend to be overused. However, they can be effective. So, if your first sentence of an essay is, "Would you volunteer to die in the place of someone that you love?" then you follow that up with something like, "Katniss Everdeen, the main character in The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, makes the same choice many readers would hope they could make in such a situation." Katniss Everdeen, the main character in The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, immediately focuses the reader on the significance of this question. It allows us to get to the narrowing part of that first paragraph. So the hook introduces the idea and intrigues us. This second sentence is part of the transition that leads us to our thesis statement. Now here we have an argument. She makes the same choice many readers would hope they could make in such a situation. Now, it's really sad to say people could hope they would die, but people hope that they would have the courage to risk their lives for people that they love. So the hook in this case is, as we said, "Would you volunteer to die in the place that someone that you love?" And that hook shows the importance of the thesis statement. And here's the eventual thesis statement that we reach. Katniss Everdeen's choice to volunteer for the Hunger Games, to essentially sacrifice herself, is only one of a series of choices that mark her as both heroic and as a likable character and a proxy for readers. Now, here are the things that you are proving in this argument. So this is about your thesis statement as well. In this case, you're going to discuss her choice to volunteer for the Hunger Games. That will be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. You're going to talk about a series of choices that mark her as heroic. So you're going to have multiple things that mark her as heroic, and that might be 2 or 3 paragraphs. We're going to discuss her as a likable character. That might be part of those paragraphs that discuss her as heroic, or it might be separate. We're going to talk about her as a proxy for readers. So these are the thesis points: her choice to volunteer, a series of choices that mark her as heroic, herself as a likable character, and a proxy for readers. This choice is tied to the proxy for readers point, particularly by our hook. Would you volunteer to die in the place of someone that you love? Proxy itself means a substitute for someone else, a substitute or agent. So in this case, Katniss becomes a substitute for her sister, but she also becomes a substitute for all the readers who would like to act that heroically in such a situation. Let's look at this again in another way. Would you volunteer to die in the place of someone that you love is our hook, and here is our argument. Katniss is a proxy for readers. So see how these two are tied? The hook itself is tied in to part of the thesis statement. Now, let's revisit the hooks. Here are the types of hooks. We're going to now talk about a surprising fact or statistic. We're going to look at the Suzanne Collins Hunger Games book throughout this entire presentation. And that will give you some senses of how many different papers you can write using the same text. In this case, our surprising fact is, in 2012, the Hunger Games trilogy sold 27.7 million copies. Diane Roback wrote this article that gave this number. The argument is, readers today are actively seeking out dystopian novels. So that would be part of the thesis statement, that readers are seeking out these dystopian novels. Let's look at a narrative. A narrative can also appear at the beginning of a paper, and it intrigues readers. So, in the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen is forced to watch as her little sister's name is drawn as a tribute for televised games that force competitors to fight to the death. Now, I might discuss this a little more. I might have an entire paragraph discussing the scene, and I might even use a quotation here. In this case, the argument is the participants in the games represent their districts metaphorically, forced to die to entertain the capital. So they represent their districts literally, in that they are forced to die, but also metaphorically, in that the districts themselves die at the whim of the capital. Quotation. So I might say something like, in the book Mockingjay, Katniss Everdeen says of another character, Peeta, sometimes when I'm alone, I take the pearl from where it lives in my pocket and try to remember the boy with the bread, the strong arms that warded off nightmares on the train, the kisses in the arena. So in this case, we're talking about Katniss and her relationship with Peeta. And the argument could be, Katniss and Peeta's relationship is symbolized by that pearl. We might have other aspects of their relationship that are symbolized by other things, like the berries. So think about how you can use quotations to tie readers to your argument, making them intrigued, making them want to know more, and tie that directly to a part of your thesis. The last type of hook that we're going to address is a point of agreement. Now this is where you tell the reader, we'll all agree here, and this moves the reader forward towards your thesis statement. So in this case, you might argue, most readers will agree that the Hunger Games novels are, in some ways, a commentary on the reality television of today. Great. That's a very interesting point, and we will agree with that. Most people will agree reality television of today is everywhere, and that the Hunger Games, because they are a televised event that mimic in some ways with the hosts and whatnot reality shows today, they say something about our current culture. Now, part of your thesis could be the Hunger Games is not only a commentary on today's reality television, it is a warning about tyranny and state power. So it's kind of a warning about where we could go and what we could become. Reminder, here are the types of hooks we've reviewed. Rhetorical questions, which are questions that you ask not to get a specific answer, but to make your reader think in specific ways. These can be overused. Surprising facts or statistics are very powerful. Just make sure that they are tied into your argument itself. Narratives, stories are always interesting. Once again, make sure that they are tied to your eventual argument. Quotation. Many of us use quotations and they become very powerful as we look at situations. Again, your quotation should be directly tied to whatever it is you end up arguing. A point of agreement is a nice place to start if you are trying to walk your audience logically from point A to point B to point C to point D, all the way to point F or G or H or Z. So remember that that's an option when you look at hooks. Here's some perspective. When you think of hooks, think of your essay's introduction as an inverted pyramid, like this. You're going to move from more general to specific. So your hook appears at the beginning, and usually your thesis statement appears at the end of a paragraph. Now it might be the end of the second or third paragraph of your paper, but make sure if you do that your text itself is much longer. The hooks introduce your topic. They show the reader that topic's importance. The rest of the introduction walks the reader to the thesis statement logically and naturally. Pretend that you are giving a tour, a guided tour of a house, and as you walk readers from room to room, explain each part in between. Don't present evidence and just hope your reader will figure it out and see the connections themselves. Here's a critical revision note. You should change your hook and thesis statement as you revise. So your hook and your thesis statement will begin in your first working draft and drafts one way. They'll look one particular way, the way that they looked when you started writing, but you will change them. In fact, you should probably change both of them before you turn in your final paper. And anytime you revise, this is important. Make sure that your hook and your thesis statement go naturally together, that they highlight the critical points that you argue. Your thesis statement itself changes greatly as you write your paper because you often don't know where you're going until you've been there. And the glory of PCs today is that, in word processing, is that you can go in and pretend that you knew where you were going from the beginning. So you write your paper and you look back and you ask yourself for each paragraph, what did I prove? Change your topic sentences to match that, and then go back to your thesis statement and make it sound as if you intended to prove everything that you ended up proving. Make your hook match. Hooray! You have a